A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at some satellite imagery of the Spratly Islands yesterday, and it is honestly wild how much the map has changed just in the last year. It feels like we are watching a slow-motion tectonic shift in real time. But it is not geological, it is geopolitical. Today's prompt from Daniel is a deep dive into the evolution of the Chinese Communist Party's governance and the escalating friction points in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. It is a perfect time to talk about this because, as of March 14, 2026, the old rules of engagement seem to have been completely tossed out the window. We are in a new landscape where the strategic patience of the past has been replaced by something much more immediate and assertive. Today's prompt from Daniel is about Chinese geopolitics, and it is a perfect time to break down how the internal logic of the party is driving everything we see in the South China Sea and Taiwan.
It was a strategy of strategic patience, economic integration, and a focus on internal development while avoiding direct confrontation with the West. But if you look at the landscape here in early 2026, that doctrine has been replaced by a much more overt, assertive posture. We are seeing the results of the fourth plenum from October 2025, where the focus shifted almost entirely toward technological self-reliance and centralized control. The party is no longer biding its time. It feels that its time has arrived.
That shift in doctrine is really the key to everything else, isn't it? It is not just about a change in personality at the top, but a fundamental restructuring of how the party views its role in the world. I am curious about the governance model itself. People talk about the Chinese Communist Party as this monolithic bloc, but the way they are managing their internal territories versus their external claims is becoming increasingly divergent. How do we define this current model? Is it still the same party we studied 10 years ago? It is a massive, obvious threat that everyone sees coming, a leader with no clear heir apparent, but no one is quite sure how to handle it without triggering a power struggle.
The 15th five-year plan, which covers 2026 through 2030, is essentially a blueprint for a fortress economy. They are prioritizing things like domestic semiconductor lithography and artificial intelligence sovereignty because they have realized that global integration is a double-edged sword. There is a younger generation of technocrats who are deeply capable, the aerospace clique and the semiconductor czars, but they are operating in an environment where any sign of personal ambition can be interpreted as a threat to the current leadership. This creates a sort of institutional paralysis where everyone is waiting for a signal from the top before making a move. It is a system built for high-speed execution but low-speed innovation in governance.
And that paralysis at home often leads to aggression abroad as a way to maintain domestic legitimacy. If the economic growth slows down, which it has, with the property market crisis and youth unemployment, you need another pillar of support. That pillar is nationalism. Let's look at the one country, two systems framework, because that was supposed to be the bridge. It was originally designed by Deng Xiaoping in the 80s as a way to show Taiwan that they could reintegrate without losing their way of life. It was the ultimate soft power lure. But looking at Hong Kong in 2026, that bridge has basically been dismantled and sold for scrap.
The erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy is a case study in how the party prioritizes political control over economic utility. For decades, Hong Kong was the golden goose, the financial lungs of the mainland. But the transition from a semi-autonomous hub to a fully integrated political landscape is nearly complete. We just saw the final sentencing of the last of the NSL 47, the pro-democracy figures caught up in the national security law. These weren't just activists, they were former lawmakers and academics. At this point, the Legislative Council is entirely pro-Beijing. The cost has been significant, though. We are looking at over 300,000 people who have emigrated using the British National Overseas Path, and foreign direct investment is down about 15% compared to 2022 levels.
I saw that figure, and it is a massive hit to their credibility as a stable financial harbor. But even with that political tightening, they are trying to maintain a weird sort of financial half autonomy. Like the stablecoin licensing initiative that just launched this month, in March 2026, it is as if they're saying, you can have your cutting-edge fintech and your crypto hubs, but only if the political guardrails are made of reinforced concrete. It is a very difficult needle to thread. How do you attract global capital while you are simultaneously arresting the people who used to run the city's civil society?
The party believes that capital is cowardly and will eventually return once the instability of protests is gone. They are betting that investors care more about access to the mainland market than they do about the rule of law in a Western sense. They want the Macau model. Macau is the quiet student in the back of the room. It is structurally dependent on the mainland through casino revenue and the flow of tourists. They haven't had the same level of political friction because the economic integration was already almost total. But even in Macau, the party has cracked down on junket operators to stop capital flight. This is a recurring theme. Control is more important than growth. That is the big failure of the one country, two systems framework. It was originally designed by Deng Xiaoping specifically to win over Taiwan. But by showing their hand in Hong Kong, Beijing has effectively destroyed the credibility of that offer.
That brings us to the comparison everyone makes, which is Taiwan. But there is a massive legal and historical distinction that often gets lost in the Hong Kong is a preview for Taiwan. Narrative. Hong Kong was a British colony that was returned via a treaty. Taiwan has a completely different status. It has never been governed by the People's Republic of China. Right. And that distinction changes the entire legal and military calculus. When we talk about Taiwan, we are talking about a state that functions with full sovereignty in every way except for formal diplomatic recognition by the majority of the world. And the military pressure they are facing right now is staggering.
The legal reality is crucial. Taiwan, or the Republic of China, has been a self-governing entity since 1949. The numbers are incredible. In 2025, we saw 5,709 incursions by the People's Liberation Army into Taiwan's air defense zone. That is a 15-fold increase since 2020. It is a strategy of exhaustion. They are forcing the Taiwanese Air Force to scramble constantly, wearing down their equipment and their pilots, while simultaneously normalizing a Chinese military presence closer and closer to Taiwan's coast. They are trying to make the presence of Chinese fighter jets feel like a daily weather report rather than a military threat.
It is a gray zone strategy. They are not launching a full-scale invasion, but they are turning up the heat until the environment becomes unbearable. And the budget reflects that too. China's defense budget for 2026 is $278 billion. That is a 7% increase during a time when their overall economic growth is supposedly slowing down. It tells you exactly where the priority lies. It is not in the consumer economy. It is in the projection of power. Even with American support, the sheer scale of the mainland's industrial capacity for shipbuilding and drone production is something we haven't seen since the lead-up to the Second World War. They are building more hulls in a year than most navies have in their entire fleet.
President Lai Ching-te has been very clear about defending sovereignty, and we are seeing regional players like Japan step up in ways they never would have a decade ago. Japan's plan to deploy missiles on islands near Taiwan, like Ishigaki and Miyako, has absolutely infuriated Beijing. It creates a chain of defense that makes a blockade or an invasion much more complicated for the People's Liberation Army. What is different now, in 2026, is how the regional players are responding. They aren't just filing diplomatic protests anymore, they are forming their own mini-lateral alliances.
Right. Japan is a huge part of this shift. Their plan to deploy missiles on islands near Taiwan has absolutely incensed Beijing. We have seen this massive pressure campaign against Tokyo, including trade restrictions on seafood and some very heated rhetoric from the foreign ministry. But Japan seems committed to the idea that Taiwan's security is inseparable from their own. It is a new axis of resistance, for lack of a better term, where you have Japan, Australia, and the Philippines creating a much more unified front than they did 5 years ago. They are realizing that strategic ambiguity doesn't work when the other side is being very unambiguous about its intentions.
Vietnam is another interesting one to watch. They have been quietly accelerating their own land reclamation in the Spratly Islands. It is a fascinating bit of geopolitical irony. They are using the exact same tactics China used a decade ago, building up reefs, installing radar, creating facts on the water. It shows that the wolf warrior approach has actually been counterproductive for Beijing in some ways. It has pushed neighbors who would normally be wary of American influence right into Washington's arms because they are more afraid of a dominant China than a distant United States. The Middle Kingdom approach only works if the neighbors are willing to be vassal states, and in 2026 they are clearly not.
Well, and that leads to the economic coercion side of the house. We have seen China use trade as a weapon against everyone from Lithuania to Australia. If you cross a political red line like opening a representative office or calling for an investigation into the origins of a virus, your wine or your timber or your beef suddenly finds itself blocked by quarantine issues. It is a very effective tool in the short term, but in the long term it is forcing every major corporation to look at China plus one supply chain strategies. You can't put all your chips on a table where the House can decide to flip the board because of a tweet or a diplomatic visit from a foreign official.
That is the de-risking versus decoupling debate that has defined the last few years. The reality is that total decoupling is nearly impossible given how integrated the global manufacturing base is. But de-risking is very real. When we talk about the architecture of information, like we did back in episode 944, we have to look at how the CCP manages the narrative of these territorial disputes. To their domestic audience, these aren't aggressive moves. They are defensive actions to reclaim stolen territory. That internal narrative makes it very hard for them to de-escalate without looking weak at home. If you tell your people for 20 years that an island is yours, you can't suddenly sign a treaty giving it away.
It creates a ratchet effect, where the tension can only go one way. I want to go back to the regional diplomatic efforts, though. There is this push for an ASEAN Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, with a target date of the end of 2026. Do you think that actually holds any water? Or is it just a way to stall while more reefs are turned into air bases? We have been hearing about this Code of Conduct for 20 years.
Historically, these negotiations have been a stalling tactic. Beijing prefers bilateral negotiations where they can use their size to bully individual smaller nations. A multilateral code of conduct is the last thing they want because it creates a unified legal front. If a deal is actually reached by the end of this year, it will likely be because the language is so vague that it doesn't actually restrict anyone's movement. The real code of conduct is being written by the presence of destroyers and Coast Guard cutters, not by diplomats in a conference room. The data shows that while they talk about peace, they are increasing the frequency of gray zone operations. Actions that are aggressive but fall just below the threshold of open war.
It is a classic might makes right framework hidden behind a thin veneer of international law. For our listeners who are trying to track this, I think it is important to distinguish between economic integration and political alignment. You can be deeply integrated into the Chinese market and still be a target for political coercion. In episode 706, we talked about building a DIY geopolitical intelligence dashboard. If you are doing that today, the metrics you should be watching are the ASEAN Code of Conduct negotiations and the specific frequency of these gray zone incursions. Don't just wait for the headline that says invasion. Watch the steady increase in the baseline of friction.
The baseline is the signal. If the daily average of sorties stays above a certain threshold, or if we see a sudden shift in the types of aircraft being used, like more electronic warfare platforms or Y-20 aerial refuelers, that tells you more than 1,000 diplomatic speeches. Also, keep an eye on the technological self-reliance benchmarks. The more China succeeds in domesticating its supply chain for high-end chips and energy production, the less leverage the rest of the world has to deter them via sanctions. If they don't need your chips, they don't fear your export controls.
It is the ultimate decoupling of interests. If they are building their own parallel financial system and their own tech stack, then the cost of a conflict drops significantly in their eyes. We have spent the last 30 years trying to make the cost of conflict too high to bear through economic interdependence. They are spending the current decade trying to lower that cost for themselves while raising it for everyone else. It is a fundamental shift in the global order.
And that brings us back to the gray rhino of succession. Whoever follows the current leadership will inherit a system that is far more powerful, but also far more brittle and isolated than the one that existed in 2012. The 15th five-year plan is going to be the blueprint for this Fortress China strategy. If you are in tech, if you are in logistics, or if you are in finance, you cannot afford to treat this as background noise anymore. It is the primary variable in your long-term planning. You have to ask yourself, what happens to my business if the Taiwan Strait is closed for 3 months?
It really is a sobering thought. Geopolitics has moved from the foreign affairs section of the paper to the front page and the business section simultaneously. We are no longer living in a world where you can just do business without considering the flag that flies over the port or the political loyalty of your software provider. The era of strategic ambiguity is ending, not just for governments, but for corporations and individuals too. You have to understand exactly where the fault lines are so you don't get swallowed when they shift.
The data is all there if you know where to look. 5,709 sorties, 15% drop in investment, $278 billion in defense spending. These aren't just numbers, they are a roadmap of intent. They tell us that the party has decided that security and control are more important than the reform and opening up model that defined the last 40 years.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground today. The internal logic of the CCP, the tragic erosion of Hong Kong civil society, the high-stakes military chess match over Taiwan, and the shifting alliances in the South China Sea. It is a lot to digest, but as we always say on this show, understanding the mechanisms is the first step toward not being caught off guard.
If you found this breakdown helpful, we have over 1,100 episodes in the archive covering everything from semiconductor physics to the history of the Qing dynasty. You can search the whole collection at myweirdprompts.com. I highly recommend checking out episode 706 if you want to build that intelligence dashboard we mentioned.
We are also on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops. Just search for My Weird Prompts and join the channel. It is the fastest way to stay in the loop in an increasingly volatile world. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumentop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power our analysis and keep the show running.
We will be watching those ASEAN negotiations closely as we head toward the end of 2026. See you in the next one.
See you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow